Make no mistake, I'm a sociopath.
One of my biggest regrets from my Class of '09 retrospective series is that I felt I didn't do the character analysis very well, particularly in the first video and particularly on Nicole. So, getting to the point, that's what this video is. I'm revisiting my analysis of Nicole to do a full examination of her character throughout the entire series. Now, you could argue that trying to dissect a character this much in a series that isn't meant to be taken seriously is dumb, but well, it's the kind of dumb I pursue on this channel, if you haven't noticed. I'm gonna try my best to look at this as fairly as I can, taking into account everything we see from Nicole to determine the ins and outs of her character and how she handles situations. Is she truly a sociopath? Is she actually intelligent? Is she actually gay? There's a lot of questions for us to answer and a lot to explore. So, enough preamble, it's time to dive in and probably make some people upset again. It might seem hard to pick a place to start, but I think we can begin with the first thing Nicole tells us about herself, that she is a sociopath. Now, my experience with psychology is one class in college, so I'm not the most well versed in this stuff, other than my own personal experience with sociopathy, but just for a basic definition, being a sociopath is defined as a pattern of antisocial behaviors and attitudes, which includes things like manipulation of others for self gain or pleasure, deceit, aggression, and a general lack of empathy for others, as well as impulsivity. On a first glance, this seems like an incredibly apt description, but we shouldn't label her just yet until we do a deeper dive into her character. Alongside this, one of the first things we learn about her is that she used to be much kinder and friendlier, and even had friends before she had to move again, thanks to her brother's actions. Due to constant moving and not being able to make a full connection with anyone, as well as seeing her father commit suicide almost right in front of her, and then blaming her, that's likely where her antisocial behaviors sprouted from, as it's understandable for her to, perhaps even subconsciously, think that none of the connections or friendships she can make will last, that something else could happen that leads to her moving again at any moment. The sad thing is that this does actually happen in a few endings, the most prevalent being the moving again ending, where on almost the first day of school, Nicole fucks up and they have to leave. So I don't believe she was inherently born with these antisocial behaviors, but rather picked them up as a consequence of her family's bad actions. However, the manipulation for self-gain and pleasure is definitely right up Nicole's alley. She constantly tries her best to manipulate situations to get exactly what she wants, with the primary example that comes to mind being when she manipulated Hunter to ruin Megan's relationship, simply because she was a bit mean to her. Like, yes, Megan was acting like a bitch, but if we really come down to it, I don't think she really deserved what happened, even if I also agree that Hunter deserved better than someone like her, given what we saw of their relationship. Yet Nicole did it anyway, arguably not just because of feeling somewhat slighted, but also because she found it fun. It's strange because when it comes to direct confrontation, she'll usually try her best to get out of a situation in any way she can. Like when Kyler threatens to beat her up, she throws somebody else in front of her. But then, when it comes to finding a workaround, she'll be as brutal as she can possibly be. I get that it comes from the fact that she's not very physically strong and feels frightened by direct conflict, but it's still really interesting to examine how she handles those different situations. How she's basically all bark and no bite when it comes to physical confrontation, but then brutal and ruthless at times when it comes to manipulation. Lack of empathy is definitely something she also struggles with in 99% of the series, even when confronted with something with a seemingly obvious right or wrong answer. However, we should mention the few times she does feel clear empathy. The first, and to me, most major one, is when Jeffrey shows the desire to kill himself. It's the only moment in the entire first game with that background noise that only plays when the serious stuff is happening, and even the choice that leads to Nicole showing empathy relates to the idea that she is feeling something. She takes on a more gentle tone, stops making jokes, and talks to him seriously, and I can't help but wonder if this scene is a glimpse into what she used to be, who she could have been if she hadn't constantly moved and seen her dad die. And it works! Almost too well, even. But the point is that Nicole is capable of summoning up the ability to empathize with someone and talk to them in a serious manner, completely cutting the bullshit and being kind, even to someone like Jeffrey, whom she spent her entire time at school bullying. However, I think this only really works because Jeffrey's intelligent, at least in the first game. If she tried this on most of the characters in the series, it simply wouldn't work because they'd just be too dumb to take it seriously. Another little side note and side theory a commenter presented to me a while back is that part of the reason Nicole bullies Jeffrey so hard might be because she possibly used to be a bit of a nerd herself when she was younger. Since she used to play video games with her brother, has some slight passing knowledge and nerdy things here and there like Pokemon and Crash Bandicoot, and even watches stuff like Mythbusters, which you could argue is a nerdy show. Sure, she comes up with an excuse for it, but even so, I think it's a fun idea and would explain why she's so mean to him, especially as well as further making their opposite natures in the series more interesting. Anyway, continuing on, the second, slightly lesser but still extremely interesting one is when she makes Jekka upset over leaving her to the whims of her brother while she goes upstairs. Their friendship is basically over, and when Jekka is pestered by the counselor once she's trying to smoke, Nicole causes a scene and gets his attention, earning herself an hour of counseling every day for the rest of the year, freeing Jekka from having him constantly hounding her during her smoke break. It's probably the most selfless thing she does in the entire series, and Jekka even says it's the nicest thing anyone has ever done for her. I only call this lesser because the comparison is treating Jeffrey, whom she despises, with compassion compared to Jekka, who she's already likes because she's her best friend. Still, even knowing that, having to spend so much time with someone as evil as the counselor is quite a sacrifice to make for Jekka, and the move really goes to show how much Nicole values their friendship. This comes up again in a conversation from Flipside, which we'll talk about later, but it shows me that there's a sort of scale to it. For Jeffrey, she had enough empathy to talk him out of suicide without making jokes, without bullshit, while being super serious and kind. Here, she sacrifices her own time and arguably her safety to make Jekka happy, earn back her friendship, and save her from her encounters with the counselor. That's a pretty big deal in my opinion. Lastly, and least important, when she turns down Kyler's invitation, and he cries, she feels bad enough to agree to go to his lacrosse convention with him. Again, it's a small thing, and once again feels scaled when you look at what she does with Jeffrey and Jekka. These moments show me that she is capable of empathy and compassion given the right circumstances. It's just that those circumstances are very, very few and far between. I genuinely think that these moments, especially the Jeffrey conversation, are brief glimpses into the kind of girl she used to be, and what she could have been if her family had fucked up her upbringing. This leads me to be almost positive that she used to be a more empathetic and compassionate person, but lost it thanks to various factors in her life. So while she might not have been born with this sort of stuff, she likely acquired it. The last thing we need to look at is impulsivity, which, oh boy, she has an outrageous amount of. Let's see. She flirts with the cop in re-up, even though how is that actually going to get you out of anything, and just lands him in the sex rehab anyway. She goes out with Colby in the choked out ending and dies for it in one timeline, even saying she wanted to fuck around without thinking about the consequences, quite literally the definition of impulsivity. That even goes double because you can go with him and then get him arrested, to which even she says later on that she doesn't know why she did it, adding to the idea that she doesn't plan out anything. I could go on, but you get the point. She constantly digs herself into deeper and deeper holes because she doesn't think about what she's doing or saying. She just goes, and most of the time, it fucks her over later. She is impulsivity to a T, so that's definitely a check. She even makes a joke about this in the diner after Jekka steals a CD, where she makes fun of Trudy for having to deal with the consequences of his actions, only to then deal with her own possible consequences later depending on what the route is. So, what are my thoughts on this? Well, overall, I would say that yes, she does seem to fit all the criteria for a sociopath. Not that anyone is probably all that surprised. To my knowledge, you can't actually receive that diagnosis unless you're an adult, so once she turned 18, then she could be given that label. Though given everything we see in her senior year in Flipside, she still absolutely fits it even as an adult. Now, again, take this with a grain of salt, as other than my own personal experiences with this and my research, this is purely conjecture. However, we still have more to discuss with her character, such as her being very obviously depressed. Now, I'm almost positive that she has underlying depression throughout the series given her multiple attempts to kill herself, self-harm, and her general apathy towards most things. However, it doesn't really come up for any significant plot of the game until we get to the suicide and failed suicide routes. Here we can see it grow stronger and stronger, building throughout the route. In Flipside, Nicole talks about how cigarettes don't taste as good as they used to, which is definitely a clear sign of depression, as it can affect various tastes of things. She begins to grow more and more overwhelmed with everyone, and in the end, she reveals that she genuinely doesn't know what it feels like to be happy. Maybe she felt it once, but the constant moving, the death of her father, not only could have exacerbated symptoms of sociopathy, but also likely given her depression. Plus, given that her father took his life, she likely has a genetic disposition for it from him. I wouldn't be surprised if this apathy is part of the reason she struggles to make friends, along with a lack of empathy, and she even tells Jekka in Flipside that she doesn't really know how to make new friends. This also tracks with how Jekka describes that although Nicole gets hit on a lot and everything, in Flipside after her suicide, people moved on incredibly quickly. Nicole wasn't really all that popular in the way we might think. Sure, she was well known and hit on a lot, but she didn't have friends, mostly because she was simply too good at pushing people away, either on purpose or just by being who she is, negative and inconsiderate. The only other time she makes meaningful connections to people outside of Jekka is Ari and Emily, and both of those had their own pile of problems. I'd also argue is much more one-sided on their end rather than on Nicole's, too. Jekka is genuinely the only person with whom she's developed such an actual connection, and honestly, their dynamic is so interesting that I think I could make a separate video about it in the future if any of you guys are interested, but that's besides the point. She's probably lonely and she doesn't even realize it, which likely doesn't help her depression. It makes me wonder if that factored into some of her decisions regarding dating Ari, but that's a discussion about whether she doesn't exactly seem to understand what makes a healthy relationship, which we'll get to in a bit. For now, I'll leave this little bit off with this idea that Nicole desperately needs more actual friends, as Jekka herself even says in Flipside. This apathy could also explain her apparent laziness. I feel this is most apparent when it comes to the pedophilic staff like the counselor and Colby. Nicole constantly complains about them, but when actually asked why she doesn't just report them, she cites that she doesn't want to deal with the work that will come with it, despite the fact that I'm sure it would be less stressful and annoying than just putting up with the pedophiles for the rest of her time in school. And we know Colby and the counselor can be reported since we see both of them go down multiple times, so I really don't understand why she thinks putting up with them is just better. I mean, I think even with the apathy in place, it just feels like weird logic to me. Regardless, her laziness also comes up in different ways that end up screwing her over later. Like when she attempts to be lazy when it comes to her project for Katz's class, which then either leads her into the path of Ari, or leads her to have to come up with a convoluted and illegal scheme involving crack that, while let's say is mostly very clever and intelligent, it leads to her needing to come up with a plan that's more work and more dangerous than the original assignment, which then ends with her in jail. This laziness definitely has moments where it fucks her over like this, and I genuinely think it has to stem from the apathy that comes from her depression. It only makes sense to me that way. The only time I think this apathy sort of breaks is when she's confronted with such a horrible situation. This situation being the escort route. Although she doesn't really give the impression too much in the route outside of a few moments, this event is absolutely traumatic for her. She even says as such, and her apathy isn't enough to save her here. In one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, after having been an escort for a few weeks, she tells Jekka that she can't stand to do any of this sober, and that's why she asks for drugs as payment instead of money, which would do more for her in the long run. Yet, despite the situation and how terrible and traumatic it is, I find it interesting that there's no mention of self-harm or attempted suicide or anything in this route, to my recollection. In other routes, she'll self-harm for stuff that doesn't seem nearly as bad, like Ari breaking up with her, but then here, she pushes through and continues living anyway. It's like her depression almost gets pushed aside in this route, which I know that's not how it works, obviously, but even so, it's fascinating to me all the same. Even her laziness goes away as she tries her best to memorize what she needs for the FYE job when working with Kelly, because in her words, she actually needs to now. She's able to do it when she needs and wants to. Now, we've covered a lot, but there's still a few things left that are a bit unrelated to the central idea of her sociopathy and depression, but that I still feel are important to discuss. One of which is, and probably the one you need to be the most careful with, is my idea that she's possibly been sexually assaulted in the past. Sure, you could just call her general hatred and distrust of men as built in, or because she was exposed to her brother, and we know how he is, but usually that kind of thing stems from something more substantial. And to me, the most plausible is the idea that she was assaulted. Now, while we have a bit of evidence for this, such as what I've already mentioned, but I also think that the fact that she seems to imply with some of her dialogue that she isn't a virgin, despite her age and general desire to basically be never near men, this leads me to believe that she might have lost her virginity, but that it wasn't exactly consensual, unfortunately. It would explain a lot of the ways she acts and treats men in general, even when they've barely done anything to warrant her ire, sometimes. Rarely. As for who, I'm not really sure. I almost want to say her brother, considering how he's already shown a potential interest in incest. He's the one with the easiest access to her, the age gap allowing for a definite power imbalance, and his general demeanor, but I'm not 100% sure. You could say that seems unrealistic because surely she would have said something if that had been the case, or she would have done everything in her power to completely avoid him. But given how we see the way she avoids ratting on the counselor or Colby, I can almost believe that she just simply didn't say anything for whatever reason. Plus, she already seems to do whatever she can to avoid her brother anyway. However, admittedly, this entire topic, both it being her brother and her being assaulted at all in her life, is merely all just a theory to try to explain some of her behaviors. I'm not fully sold on it, but it felt like something worth bringing up. As we now badly transition to something else, another smaller thing to discuss is her general misunderstanding of what healthy relationships are. Ari is generally a huge thing in this entire discussion, to which Nicole is an absolutely abusive partner, and even does her best to deny it when Ari confronts her. But there's so many conversations she has with Jekka about relationships that show she genuinely doesn't seem to understand what a healthy relationship even is. Granted, that probably comes from the fact that her mother repeatedly got divorced, and that was what she was subjected to. But even so, it's honestly insane how often she says something is okay or talks about something in a relationship that's just absolutely atrociously unhealthy. She also gets hyperfixations on things from time to time, which to my knowledge is usually only associated with ADHD or autism, which I don't think she has, so I find it a bit interesting. The two main examples I can think of are how she spends the entire anime pilot obsessed with getting the fuck belt from Emily, or how in Ari's route, she talks to herself multiple times about her ideas for a game show. It's a more minor character trait of hers, but one that kind of confuses me as to where it stems from, considering it feels like the opposite of how she should react, given what we know about her. In a similar vein, I wanted to bring up that while her voice is usually flat, motionless, and apathetic, or at the most, sarcastic, she does have moments where that breaks, and she sounds genuinely afraid. The two main times I can think of are when Katz is killed during the drug deal, which is where she's basically hyperventilating, and when Jeffrey takes a picture of her in her underwear. While I understand those being very stressful situations, it does feel weird to think about her panicking about Jeffrey when you remember that she literally gets shot by the mall cop and doesn't even seem to freak out this much. It's kind of strange when you really give it some thought, is what I'm saying. Lastly, or second to last, her intelligence. Nicole is kind of interesting because sometimes she displays a remarkable sense of intelligence and cleverness, like when she comes up with a drug dealing idea in that route, or the long term plan to fuck over Megan. However, in other regards, she's just completely dumb, like having a 1.0 GPA. I understand that it's because of school, she doesn't care at all, and that's why her grades are so atrocious, but it feels like in her general life she doesn't apply herself either. Though that's once again likely because of her general apathy towards life thanks to her depression. She only really applies herself when she deems it necessary, as with the examples I listed, or when she really needs to, like escort. I think my general thoughts on her intelligence is that she is inherently smarter than she gives herself credit for. She would just never apply that in anything that she doesn't think will benefit her, and in her daily life, she chooses not to really think much about anything and just acts, fueled by the impulsiveness of her sociopathy. And with that, we've covered mostly everything. The only thing left is the least serious, and that's the fact that I'm absolutely convinced she is not straight. If you haven't seen my retrospectives, or at least my video compiling all the gay moments Jekka and Nicole have, then let me just say, there is an insane number of times that Nicole makes gay jokes, or has called Jekka pretty, is implied to have literally had sex with Ari, which is a whole other level of gay from just dating for the hell of it, says she'd let Emily fuck her dead body, and just consistently says stuff that absolutely comes across as gay. However, although she did have sex with Ari, I honestly think it was probably more out of curiosity, or simply because she enjoyed the control in the bedroom, the same she does everywhere else in the relationship, because I also absolutely believe she's asexual. She doesn't even understand why Ari, a full-on lesbian, gets flustered seeing her naked, despite the feeling that feels like an obvious thing any person with a sexual drive and desire would understand. On top of that, going back to the Emily thing, her stipulation is that she wants Emily to have sex with her, but only if she's dead, i.e., only if she can't feel it herself. Plus, despite talking about marrying a rich husband and all that, let's be honest, it's just for the money. I think if gay marriage had been legal at the time, she would have also considered marrying a rich woman. Probably more than a man, actually. Basically, I don't think she has any real interest in men, both because of potential past trauma and because no man is going to be enough for her. Straight up. Straight up. So, in short, I think she's an asexual lesbian. I don't necessarily think she's good in a relationship because she's too unstable, but I think if the circumstances were right, she'd be happy in one. It's just that she has so much trauma and a poor attitude and everything that it's nearly impossible. But who knows, maybe she ends up being better eventually, or just gets with Jekka in some more hopeful timeline. That would be nice. Or I'm just being hopeful. Nicole is a terrible person. She's a sociopathic, depressed girl with no life goals, a horrible attitude, downright evil actions and behaviors, an unfair look in life, an ease of judging people super easily, an inability to make meaningful connections, much less friends, and a general hatred for most things. She's apathetic, miserable, lonely, and treats people with disrespect and a lack of compassion or empathy because she simply cannot muster it up unless under specific circumstances. She's a bully who thinks she's better and smarter than most people, is an impulsive misandrist likely ruined by trauma that at this point seems like it couldn't be fixed in anything less than years of therapy, and generally makes life worse for the people around her. She's evil and mean and terrible. And it works so well. Class of '09 as a series would not be nearly as fun or enjoyable if Nicole were a good person. In fact, it wouldn't work at all. She is a perfectly designed protagonist for this sort of series, and although she is terrible and impulsive, that leads us to all the interesting scenarios we could see play out throughout the series, even if mostly in the first two games. Though those two are far better, to be fair. Nicole makes these games work, makes them fun, makes you get invested in just how badly things are going to turn out by the end, or she makes you determined to get that one single good ending, to get Nicole to just survive despite her efforts to ruin herself at every turn. Nicole is one of my favorite protagonists, simply by how insane she is and how well she fits such an insane series in turn, and the series wouldn't be the same without her. So why the fuck did they think that Flipside would work? I get he wanted to tank the series and everything, but god fucking damn it, why?